The Mojave Desert stretched endlessly under the scorching sun, its silence broken only by the desperate struggles of three men bound to weathered fence posts. Jake Morrison, Tom Bradley, and Carlos Vega had been left to die by tech billionaire Marcus Blackwood, punishment for stumbling upon his illegal land grab operation that would destroy dozens of family ranches. But something unexpected happened in that desolate wasteland. A magnificent white stallion appeared, circling the dying men with an almost human intelligence. Jake recognized the horse immediately. It was Thunder, the legendary Mustang that belonged to his grandfather, a Paiute medicine man who'd sworn the animal possessed an ancient spirit of protection. As vultures gathered overhead and their water ran out, Thunder began performing impossible acts. The stallion loosened ropes with precision, provided shade during the brutal midday heat, and somehow led a rescue team across hundreds of miles of trackless desert. What the three cowboys didn't know was that their survival would expose Blackwood's conspiracy and ignite a war between old-world justice and modern greed. But could a mystical horse really be their guardian angel, or was something far more extraordinary at work? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The events that led to their predicament began 3 days earlier at the Double Bar Ranch, where the morning air carried the scent of sagebrush and the promise of another back-breaking day. Jake Morrison adjusted his worn Stetson as he watched Tom Bradley struggle with a stubborn calf near the water trough. At Toothy 8, Jake had spent most of his life working cattle, but lately something felt different about the land around them. "You notice how many surveyors been coming through?" Carlos Vega called out from the corral, his weathered hands expertly mending a section of fence. The veteran cowboy had worked these ranges longer than anyone, and his instincts were rarely wrong. Tom straightened up, wiping sweat from his brow. "Been wondering about that myself. Yesterday, I saw 3 different crews with fancy equipment, all asking questions about property lines." Jake's jaw tightened. His grandfather's stories echoed in his mind, tales of white men with papers and promises who always seemed to take more than they gave. Maybe we should ride out to Widow's Peak tomorrow, see what's really going on. The next morning, the 3 cowboys saddled their horses and headed toward the isolated mesa where several survey teams had been spotted. The ride took them through familiar territory that Jake's family had worked for generations, past the sacred springs where his grandfather once performed ceremonies before the old ways were forgotten. What they discovered at Widow's Peak changed everything. Hidden behind a cluster of boulders sat a mobile command center bristling with satellite dishes and computer equipment. Through the windows, they could see detailed maps of the entire valley, marked with red zones that encompassed every major ranch in the area. "Look at this," Tom whispered, pointing to documents scattered across a folding table outside the trailer. The papers bore the letterhead of Blackwood Industries and detailed a massive development project called Desert Vista Technopark. Carlos picked up a thick folder marked Acquisition Strategy and flipped through pages of environmental reports, water rights transfers, and legal opinions. His face grew darker with each page. "They're planning to buy out every ranch in a 50-mile radius. Says here they're using some kind of contamination scare to force sales at below-market prices." Jake studied a geological survey that made his blood run cold. "They're claiming the groundwater is polluted with industrial runoff from the old mining operation. But that's impossible. My grandfather tested these springs for decades. The water's been pure since before white settlers arrived." The sound of approaching helicopters cut through their conversation. 2 black aircraft appeared over the ridge, moving fast and low. The cowboys scrambled to gather the documents, but it was too late. Armed security personnel rappelled from the helicopters, surrounding them with military precision. Marcus Blackwood emerged from the command trailer, his expensive suit looking out of place in the desert setting. The tech mogul was younger than Jake had expected, with cold blue eyes and the kind of confidence that came from never hearing the word no. "Gentlemen, "You've wandered into a restricted area," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone accustomed to absolute power. "I'm afraid you've seen things that weren't meant for public consumption." Jake stepped forward, still clutching the contamination report. "This is all lies. You're trying to steal people's land based on fake environmental data." Blackwood's smile never wavered. "Prove it." He nodded to his security team. "Take them to the old boundary markers near Devil's Canyon. Make sure they understand the consequences of trespassing on private property." As zip ties cut into their wrists and black hoods dropped over their heads, Jake's last clear thought was of his grandfather's warnings about the white stallion that appeared when the spirits demanded justice. He'd always dismissed those stories as folklore, but now, facing certain death in the merciless desert, he found himself hoping that some legends were true. The morning sun blazed mercilessly overhead as Jake Martinez wiped sweat from his brow, his calloused hands gripping the fence post he'd been wrestling with for the better part of an hour. The Blackstone Ranch stretched endlessly in every direction, a sea of scrubland and cattle that had become his world for the past 3 years. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid honest wages and kept him far from the troubles that had driven him out of El Paso. "You gonna stand there admiring your handiwork all day, or you gonna help us with this water line?" Tommy Chen called out from 50 yards away, his voice carrying a hint of good-natured frustration. The youngest of their crew at barely 22, Tommy had the energy of a colt and twice the stubbornness. Jake grinned and shouldered his post-hole digger. "Keep your shirt on, college boy. Some of us take pride in doing things right the first time." The third member of their team, Marcus Washington, looked up from where he knelt examining a section of damaged pipeline. At 45, Marcus was the unofficial leader of their small crew, a man whose weathered face told stories of decades spent under the unforgiving Texas sun. His military background showed in everything he did, from the precise way he maintained his tools to the methodical approach he took to every task. "This line's been sabotaged," Marcus said quietly, running his fingers along a clean cut in the metal pipe. "This wasn't wear and tear or cattle damage. Someone took a hacksaw to it." Jake and Tommy exchanged glances. Water theft wasn't uncommon in this part of the state, but the Blackstone Ranch was hardly hurting for resources. Richard Blackstone, their employer, was one of the wealthiest men in Texas, his fortune built on oil, real estate, and cattle. The ranch was more of a hobby for him than a necessity. "Maybe it's those environmentalist protesters again," Tommy suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "They've been making noise about the ranch's water usage." Marcus shook his head. "This is different. Look at the angle of the cut, the precision. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing and where to hit us." He stood, brushing dust from his knees. "We need to report this to Blackstone." The main house loomed like a fortress against the horizon, its Spanish colonial architecture a stark contrast to the modest bunkhouse where the ranch hands lived. As they approached, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Blackstone's usual fleet of expensive cars was absent from the circular driveway, replaced by a single black SUV with tinted windows. They found Blackstone in his study, but he wasn't alone. 2 men in expensive suits flanked his desk, their postures suggesting they weren't here for a social call. One was tall and gaunt with silver hair, while the other was younger, broader, with the kind of build that spoke of serious gym time. "Mr. Blackstone," Marcus began, removing his hat out of respect. "We've got a problem with the North Water Line. Someone's been—" "Not now, Washington," Blackstone interrupted, his usual affable demeanor nowhere to be found. The billionaire looked haggard, his typically perfect appearance disheveled. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, and his hands trembled slightly as he reached for a glass of whiskey, despite the early hour. The younger man in the suit stepped forward. "Actually, Mr. Blackstone, this might be perfect timing." His voice carried a slight accent that Jake couldn't quite place. "These are the men who worked that section of the ranch, correct?" Blackstone nodded reluctantly. "Jake Martinez, Tommy Chen, Marcus Washington. They're good men, loyal. Loyalty can be flexible," the silver-haired man observed, his pale eyes studying the three ranch hands with unsettling intensity. "The question is whether it's worth the risk." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Whatever was happening here, they'd walked into the middle of something dangerous. He caught Marcus's eye and saw his own concern reflected there. "Perhaps we should discuss this privately," Marcus suggested, starting to back toward the door. "I'm afraid that's not possible," the younger man said, and suddenly there was a gun in his hand, appearing so quickly Jake barely saw the drawer. "You see, gentlemen, you've arrived at a rather inconvenient moment. Mr. Blackstone and my associates were just concluding some business that requires absolute discretion." Tommy's face had gone pale. "Look, we didn't see anything. We just came to report some damaged equipment. We can forget." "Can you?" the silver-haired man asked softly. "Can you forget the shipping manifests you might have seen? The late-night deliveries to the old mine shaft? The unmarked trucks that come and go under cover of darkness?" Jake's mind raced. They had noticed unusual activity lately, but they'd assumed it was related to Blackstone's oil operations. Now, seeing the fear in their employer's eyes and the cold professionalism of these strangers, he realized they'd stumbled onto something far more sinister. The younger man's gun never wavered. "Mr. Blackstone, I believe a drive in the desert would be beneficial for everyone involved." The sun climbed mercilessly overhead as Jake forced his eyes open, sand crusting his lashes like broken glass. His tongue felt swollen, a dead thing in his mouth that tasted of copper and grit. Somewhere nearby, he could hear Marcus groaning, a low sound that barely registered above the whisper of wind across the dunes. "Tommy!" Jake croaked, rolling onto his side. Pain shot through his ribs where Castellano's men had worked him over with their boots. "Tommy, you alive?" A weak cough answered him from behind a scrub of sage. Jake crawled toward the sound, his hands leaving bloody prints in the sand where the rope burns had torn his palms raw. He found Tommy curled in a ball, his young face blistered and swollen, but his chest rising and falling in steady rhythm. "Water," Tommy whispered, his lips cracked and bleeding. "Please." Jake's heart sank. Their captors had stripped them of everything, guns, boots, even their hats, left them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the promise of a slow, agonizing death under the desert sun. The nearest town had to be 50 miles in any direction, and Jake wasn't even sure which direction that might be. Marcus appeared from behind a boulder, moving like an old man despite being barely 30. Blood had dried in a dark line from his temple to his jaw, and his left eye was swollen shut. "Bastards took my watch," he muttered, then spit pink saliva into the sand. "Can't tell how long we've been out here." "Long enough," Jake said, studying the position of the sun. "Maybe 3-4 hours since they dumped us." He struggled to his feet, swaying as the desert spun around him. "We need shelter. This heat'll cook us alive if we don't find shade." They spent the next hour searching for anything that might provide relief from the blazing sun. The landscape stretched endlessly in all directions, rolling hills of sand and stone broken only by the occasional Joshua tree or cluster of barrel cactus. No caves, no overhangs, nothing that offered more than a sliver of shadow. Tommy collapsed twice before they found a depression between two low ridges where the sand ran deeper. They hollowed out a space large enough for the three of them to huddle together, using their shirts to create a makeshift canopy. It wasn't much, but it cut the worst of the heat. "We're gonna die out here," Tommy said, his voice barely a whisper. At 19, he was the youngest of them, barely old enough to shave. He'd been working the Circle bar for less than 6 months, still green enough to believe that hard work and honesty meant something in this world. "Like hell we are," Marcus growled, though Jake could hear the doubt creeping into his voice. "I got a wife and 2 kids back in Millfield. I ain't dying in this godforsaken place." Jake said nothing, but the mathematics of their situation played out grimly in his head. Without water, they had maybe 2 days in this heat, less if they tried to walk during the day. Their only chance was to move at night, follow the stars, and hope they stumbled across a road or a ranch before their bodies gave out. The afternoon crawled by with brutal slowness. They took turns keeping watch, though for what, none of them could say. Castellano's men were long gone, and the only other living things in this wasteland were the buzzards that had begun circling overhead, black specks against the merciless blue sky. As the sun finally began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the desert in shades of orange and red, Jake made his decision. Soon as it's dark, we move. Head east toward the highway. If we're lucky, we might hit the interstate by dawn. And if we're not lucky? Tommy asked. Jake met the boy's eyes. Then we keep walking until we can't walk anymore. That's when they heard it. A sound so unexpected that all three men froze, wondering if the heat had finally driven them mad. Hoofbeats. Steady and rhythmic, growing closer with each passing second. Marcus grabbed Jake's arm. "You hear that?" "Yeah," Jake breathed, hardly daring to hope. They scrambled up the side of the ridge, ignoring the sand that slid away beneath their feet. What they saw on the other side defied explanation. A horse stood silhouetted against the sunset, its coat so white it seemed to glow with its own light. The animal was magnificent, tall and proud, with a flowing mane that caught the evening breeze like spun silk. But it was alone. No rider, no saddle, no bridle. Just a wild stallion standing motionless in the desert, watching them with dark, intelligent eyes. "Where the hell did he come from?" Marcus whispered. The horse snorted once, a sound that seemed almost like laughter, then turned and began walking away at an easy pace. After a few steps, it stopped and looked back at them, ears pricked forward. "Son of a bitch wants us to follow him," Jake said, wonder creeping into his voice. The white stallion appeared like a mirage against the crimson dawn, its hooves silent on the hardpan as it approached the three figures sprawled beneath the dying mesquite. Jake's eyes fluttered open first, his cracked lips forming words that wouldn't come. The magnificent creature stood no more than 10 feet away, its coat gleaming pearl white in the early light, muscles rippling beneath skin that seemed to glow with its own inner fire. "Jesus," Marcus croaked, struggling to prop himself up on his elbows. "You seeing this too?" Carlos remained motionless, his breathing shallow and labored. The bullet wound in his shoulder had festered overnight, and fever burned through his body like wildfire. The stallion stepped closer, lowering its massive head to sniff at the injured man's face. Its breath was warm and sweet, carrying the scent of distant springs and green pastures. Jake forced himself to sit up, every movement sending waves of pain through his dehydrated body. "Easy there, boy," he whispered, extending a trembling hand toward the animal. The stallion didn't shy away. Instead, it pressed its velvet muzzle against Jake's palm, and in that moment something passed between them, an understanding that transcended the boundaries between man and beast. The horse turned and walked several paces toward a rocky outcropping Jake hadn't noticed before. It stopped, looked back at the men, then continued forward. The message was clear. "He wants us to follow," Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Carlos can't walk," Jake replied, studying his friend's pallid face. "Hell, I'm not sure any of us can." The stallion returned, circling them once before approaching Carlos directly. It knelt down beside the wounded man, folding its powerful legs beneath its body. The gesture was so deliberate, so human in its intention, that both Jake and Marcus stared in amazement. "I'll be damned," Marcus breathed. "He's offering to carry him." Working together, they managed to lift Carlos onto the stallion's broad back. The animal remained perfectly still throughout the process, as if it understood the gravity of the situation. Once Carlos was secure, the stallion rose smoothly to its feet and began walking toward the rocky formation. Jake and Marcus stumbled along behind, their legs unsteady but driven by hope and the promise of salvation. The rocks provided blessed shade, but more importantly, they concealed a narrow cave opening that led deep into the earth. Cool air flowed from the entrance, carrying with it the sound Jake had prayed to hear: running water. The cave descended gradually, its walls smooth and worn by countless years of erosion. Ancient petroglyphs covered the stone surfaces, telling stories of hunts and ceremonies, of a time when this land was green and abundant. The stallion moved confidently through the darkness, as if it had traveled this path many times before. They emerged into a hidden chamber where an underground spring bubbled up from the earth, forming a small pool of crystal-clear water. Jake fell to his knees beside it, cupping the precious liquid in his hands and drinking deeply. Marcus did the same, tears of relief streaming down his dust-caked face. They carefully moved Carlos from the stallion's back to a flat stone beside the pool. The cool water helped bring down his fever, and they used strips torn from their shirts to clean and redress his wound. The stallion watched over them like a guardian, occasionally drinking from the far edge of the pool but never straying far from the men. As the hours passed and their strength began to return, Jake found himself studying the animal more closely. There were scars on its hide, old rope burns around the neck and legs, marks that spoke of a violent past. This was no wild mustang. Someone had tried to break this magnificent creature and failed. "You know who this horse belongs to, don't you?" Marcus said, following Jake's gaze. Jake nodded slowly. "Montgomery's been hunting this stallion for years, offered a $1,000 bounty to anyone who could bring it in alive. Now we know why he wants it so bad," Marcus replied. "This horse knows every secret hiding place in 100 square miles, every water source, every cave, every trail." The stallion's ears pricked forward at the mention of Montgomery's name, and its dark eyes seemed to flash with an intelligence that was almost human. Jake reached out and placed his hand on the animal's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath his palm. "You hate him as much as we do, don't you?" Jake whispered. "He tried to break you, just like he breaks everything else." The stallion's response was to step closer, pressing its forehead against Jake's chest in what could only be described as an embrace of understanding. In that moment, an alliance was born. 3 broken men and a wild spirit united by their shared enemy and their determination to survive. Outside the cave, the desert continued its merciless assault, but here, in this hidden sanctuary, hope flickered to life like a candle in the darkness. The desert stretched before them like an ocean of fire, heat waves dancing across the sand in mockery of their desperation. Jake's tongue felt like leather in his mouth as he surveyed their meager supplies scattered across the rocky outcrop where they'd taken shelter. 2 canteens, half empty, a handful of jerky that would barely sustain them through another day. And somewhere out there, Garrett's men were hunting them like wolves tracking wounded prey. "We can't stay here," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that carried nothing but more heat and grit. Dark circles ringed his eyes, and his usually steady hands trembled as he reached for his water. "They'll find us by nightfall." Tommy nodded toward the horizon where dust clouds marked the search party's methodical sweep across the wasteland. "Garrett's got them riding in grids, professional hunters, every one of them." He spat into the sand, the moisture evaporating instantly. Should have known a man with his money wouldn't send amateurs to clean up his mess. Jake closed his eyes, trying to block out the memory of what they'd witnessed in that hidden chamber beneath Garrett's mansion. The photographs, the documentation, the evidence of crimes that stretched back decades. They'd stumbled onto something that made their cattle-rustling discovery look like child's play, something worth killing for. The white stallion appeared without warning, as if materialized from the desert itself. One moment, the rocky slope below them was empty. The next, the magnificent creature stood there, coat gleaming like fresh snow despite the dust and heat. It regarded them with intelligent dark eyes, nostrils flaring as it tested their scent on the wind. "Jesus," Miguel breathed, his hand moving instinctively toward the rope at his belt before stopping. "Look at the size of that animal." The horse was indeed massive, easily 17 hands high, with the kind of muscular build that spoke of speed and endurance. No brand marked its flanks, no halter or rope suggested human ownership. Yet there was something almost deliberate about its appearance, as if it had sought them out, rather than stumbled upon their hiding place. Jake studied the creature with a horseman's practiced eye. The stallion's breathing was steady despite the heat, its stance alert but not agitated. Wild horses were typically skittish around humans, especially in open terrain where escape routes were limited. This one showed no such concern. "There's something not right about this," Tommy muttered, but his voice carried wonder rather than fear. "Horses don't survive out here alone. Nothing does." As if responding to his words, the stallion turned its head toward the north, ears pricked forward with sudden attention. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer, riders emerged from behind a mesa, too far to make out details, but close enough that the geometric pattern of their search was becoming clear. Garrett's men were closing the net with military precision. The white horse looked back at them, then deliberately walked several paces north before stopping and turning again. The message was unmistakable. "It wants us to follow," Jake said, hardly believing his own words. He'd worked with horses his entire life, understood their intelligence and capacity for forming bonds with humans. But this felt different, almost supernatural in its clarity. Miguel struggled to his feet, swaying slightly as the blood rushed from his head. "Follow it where? Deeper into the desert? That's suicide." "Staying here is suicide," Jake replied, gathering their scattered supplies. The riders were definitely closer now, their dust trails converging on the rocky outcrop like fingers of an enclosing fist. "And if that animal can survive out here, maybe it knows something we don't." The stallion waited patiently as they collected their gear, only moving when all three men had descended from their shelter. It maintained a steady pace, not the ground-eating gallop Jake expected, but a purposeful walk that seemed calculated to match their human limitations. Every few minutes it would pause, allowing them to catch up while scanning the surrounding terrain with those remarkably intelligent eyes. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace that sucked moisture from their bodies with ruthless efficiency. Jake's shirt was soaked with sweat that evaporated before it could provide any cooling relief. Behind them, the sound of pursuit grew fainter as they followed the stallion across terrain that seemed impossible for mounted men to navigate quickly. The horse led them through a maze of arroyos and rock formations, choosing paths that provided cover from the searching eyes above. Several times Jake was certain they were lost, following the animal deeper into a wasteland that held nothing but death. Then the stallion would emerge onto another hidden trail, another corridor through the seemingly impassable landscape. As the afternoon wore on, Jake began to understand they were following something more than instinct. The white horse moved with the confidence of intimate knowledge, as if every stone and shadow held meaning. Whatever force had brought this creature to them, it offered their only hope of escape from Garrett's hunters and the terrible secret that had marked them for death. The white stallion stood motionless at the edge of the ravine, its coat gleaming like burnished silver in the harsh morning light. Jake squinted through swollen eyes, certain the desert heat was playing tricks on his mind. But the horse remained, real as the parched earth beneath him, watching the three men with an intelligence that seemed almost human. "You seeing this too?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely a croak. Tommy nodded weakly, unable to speak. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his face sunburned beyond recognition. They'd spent the night huddled together in the meager shade of an outcropping, sharing the last drops of water from Jake's canteen. Now, with the sun climbing toward its merciless peak, they faced the grim reality that they wouldn't survive another day. The stallion took a step closer, then another. Its hooves made no sound on the rocky ground. Jake noticed the animal bore no brands, no signs of human ownership. This was a wild horse, yet it moved with purpose, as if drawn to their desperate situation by some force beyond understanding. "Easy, boy," Jake murmured, extending a trembling hand. The stallion's dark eyes fixed on his, and for a moment, Jake felt a strange calm wash over him. The horse's presence seemed to push back against the crushing despair that had settled over them like a shroud. The stallion approached until Jake could feel its warm breath on his palm. Then, without warning, the horse turned and walked several paces away before stopping and looking back expectantly. "He wants us to follow," Marcus said, struggling to his feet. His legs shook with the effort, but determination burned in his eyes. "I don't know how, but that horse knows something we don't." Jake helped Tommy stand, the youngest of their group leaning heavily against him. They stumbled forward, following the stallion as it led them along the ravine's edge. The horse moved at a deliberate pace, stopping frequently to ensure they kept up. Each step was agony for the three men, but something about the animal's presence gave them strength they didn't know they possessed. The sun climbed higher, and the desert began to shimmer with heat waves. Just when Jake thought they couldn't take another step, the stallion veered toward what appeared to be solid rock face. As they drew closer, Jake realized it was an optical illusion. A narrow passage cut through the stone, hidden from view until you were directly in front of it. The stallion disappeared into the shadowy opening. The three men hesitated for only a moment before following. The passage was blessedly cool, carved by centuries of wind and flash floods. It twisted and turned, leading them deeper into the heart of the mesa. After what felt like an eternity, the passage opened into a hidden canyon. Jake's breath caught in his throat. A small pool of crystal-clear water reflected the ribbon of blue sky visible between the canyon walls. Desert willows provided precious shade, their leaves rustling in a gentle breeze that didn't exist in the wasteland above. The stallion stood beside the pool, watching as the three men stumbled forward and fell to their knees at the water's edge. Jake cupped the precious liquid in his hands, drinking deeply. It was the sweetest water he'd ever tasted, cool and clean and life-giving. "Careful," he warned the others. "Not too much at once." They drank slowly, methodically, feeling strength return to their bodies with each swallow. The stallion moved to a patch of grass growing near the water and began to graze, as if this hidden oasis was a familiar sanctuary. As the immediate desperation of thirst faded, Jake's mind began to clear. Whitmore had left them to die, but they were alive. More than that, they had knowledge that could destroy the man who'd tried to murder them. The memory of those photographs, the evidence of Whitmore's partnership with the cartel, burned bright in his memory. "We need to get back to civilization," Jake said, splashing water on his burned face. "Tell people what we saw." "Who's going to believe 3 ranch hands against a billionaire?" Tommy asked, his voice stronger now but still bitter with pain. "Someone will," Marcus said firmly. "We just need to find the right someone. A reporter, maybe, or the FBI." Jake looked at the white stallion, which had raised its head and was watching them again with those knowing eyes. "First, we need to figure out how to get out of here alive." The stallion whickered softly, almost as if responding to his words. It moved toward another passage Jake hadn't noticed before, partially concealed behind a stand of desert willows. The horse looked back at them expectantly. Jake stood slowly, testing his renewed strength. The water and shade had worked miracles, but he knew they were far from safe. Whitmore would assume they were dead by now, which might give them an advantage, but only if they could find their way back to the world of the living. "Looks like our friend here isn't done helping us yet," Jake said, shouldering his empty canteen. The stallion waited patiently as the three men gathered what strength they could, preparing to follow their unlikely savior deeper into the desert's hidden secrets. The white stallion moved like liquid mercury across the desert floor, its hooves barely seeming to touch the hard pan as it led them through a maze of arroyos and hidden passages. Marcus gripped the makeshift reins, his body still weak from their ordeal, while Jake and Elena followed on foot, their water bottles sloshing with the precious liquid they'd discovered at the hidden spring. The horse seemed to know exactly where it was going, taking them along routes that offered shade during the worst heat of the day and shelter when the wind picked up. It was as if the animal possessed an intimate knowledge of every rock formation, every cave, every secret the desert held. When Elena stumbled, exhausted, the stallion would slow its pace, sometimes stopping entirely until she could catch her breath. "It's like he's reading our minds," Jake muttered, wiping sweat from his forehead as they rested in the shadow of a towering boulder. "Never seen anything like it." Elena studied the horse with wonder. Its coat was pristine white, almost luminous in the harsh sunlight, yet it showed no signs of the wear and tear that wild horses typically bore. No scars, no brands, no evidence of ever having been broken or owned. "Where do you think it came from?" Marcus ran his hand along the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful muscles beneath the silken coat. "Don't know, but it saved our lives. That spring back there, we never would have found it without him. The water had changed everything. What had seemed like certain death just hours before now felt like the beginning of something else entirely. They were alive, they were mobile, and they had evidence of Thornfield's crimes tucked safely in Elena's saddlebag, which had somehow survived their escape from the burning research facility. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the stallion lifted its head and nickered softly. In the distance, Marcus could make out something that didn't belong to the natural landscape, a thin line of smoke rising into the evening air. "Campfire," Jake said, shading his eyes with his hand. "Could be anyone," Elena warned. "Thornfield's men, other ranch hands, maybe even law enforcement." The horse began moving toward the smoke without waiting for their decision, and they found themselves following once again. As they drew closer, they could make out the warm glow of a fire nestled in a small canyon, protected from the wind. The silhouettes of two figures moved around the flames, and the smell of coffee and beans carried on the evening breeze. Marcus felt his stomach clench with hunger, but his hand instinctively moved to the knife at his belt. After everything they'd been through, trust didn't come easily. The stallion brought them to the edge of the canyon and stopped, as if waiting for them to make the final decision. One of the figures by the fire looked up, and Marcus saw the weathered face of an older man, his hair silver in the firelight. "Well, I'll be damned," the man called out, his voice carrying a hint of an accent Marcus couldn't place. "Rosa, we got visitors." A woman emerged from the shadows. Native American, Marcus guessed, with long grey hair braided down her back and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. She looked at them, then at the white stallion, and something passed over her features. Surprise, maybe, or recognition. "Been waiting for you," she said simply, as if three strangers appearing out of the desert on foot and horseback was the most natural thing in the world. Jake shot a glance at Marcus and Elena. "Waiting for us?" The older man, presumably Rosa's companion, gestured toward the fire. "Come on down. Got plenty of food, and you look like you could use some." Marcus hesitated, but the stallion was already picking its way down the narrow path into the canyon, leaving them little choice but to follow. As they descended, he noticed things that made him more curious than concerned. A small trailer tucked against the canyon wall, solar panels gleaming on its roof, and equipment that looked scientific rather than cowboy. Rosa studied the white horse with an intensity that made Marcus uneasy. "Where did you find him?" "He found us," Elena answered truthfully. "Saved our lives, actually." "Course he did," Rosa said, as if this explained everything. She approached the stallion without fear, extending her hand. The horse lowered its magnificent head and allowed her to touch its muzzle. "Been wondering when you'd show up again, old friend." The older man introduced himself as Dr. Samuel Martinez, retired professor of geology from the University of Arizona. Rosa, he explained, was Dr. Rosa Blackhorse, an environmental scientist who had been studying the unusual mineral compositions in this part of the desert. "Unusual how?" Elena asked, accepting a cup of coffee that tasted better than anything she'd ever drunk. Rosa and Dr. Martinez exchanged a look. "Same kind of unusual that probably got you three into whatever trouble brought you out here," Dr. Martinez said carefully. "Question is, you ready to hear about what's really going on in this desert?" The white stallion moved through the desert like a ghost made flesh, his hooves finding purchase on rocky ledges that would have sent lesser horses tumbling to their deaths. Jake clung to the magnificent creature's mane, his body screaming in protest with every jarring step, while Miguel and Carlos followed on foot behind them, their faces grim with determination despite their exhaustion. They had been traveling for what felt like hours when the stallion suddenly stopped, his ears pricking forward with an alertness that made Jake's pulse quicken. In the distance, barely visible through the heat shimmer, a plume of dust rose against the azure sky, vehicles moving fast across the desert floor. "Company," Miguel muttered, shading his eyes against the sun's merciless glare. The stallion snorted and began picking his way down a steep ravine as if he understood the need for concealment. Jake marveled at the animal's intelligence, wondering not for the first time what force had brought this creature to them in their darkest hour. The horse moved with purpose, leading them to a narrow canyon where ancient petroglyphs decorated the sandstone walls and blessed shade offered respite from the desert's fury. Carlos collapsed against a boulder, his breathing labored. "How did they find us so fast?" "Helicopters," Jake said grimly, sliding down from the stallion's back with considerable effort. "Pemberton's got resources we can't even imagine, but he's also got something to hide, which means he's desperate." Miguel found a trickle of water seeping from the rock face and called the others over. They took turns drinking the precious liquid, the stallion lowering his great head to lap delicately at the shallow pool that had formed in a depression at the base of the cliff. "We can't keep running forever," Carlos said, wiping moisture from his cracked lips. "Even with our four-legged guardian angel here, we're still 3 men against an army." Jake studied the petroglyphs while he considered their options. Ancient hunters pursuing deer across stone, their stories carved into permanence by hands long since turned to dust. These people had survived in this harsh land for generations, facing challenges that would have broken weaker spirits. "Then we stop running," Jake said finally. "We make our stand." "With what weapons?" Miguel asked. "Your pretty smile?" Before Jake could answer, the stallion lifted his head sharply, his nostrils flaring. A moment later they heard it too, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the desert air. The sound grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls in a way that made it impossible to determine the aircraft's exact location. The stallion moved deeper into the canyon, and they followed, discovering that the narrow passage opened into a hidden valley where desert willows grew around a genuine spring. Ancient ruins dotted the landscape, the remnants of some long-forgotten settlement where people had once carved out lives in this unforgiving wilderness. "This place," Carlos whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "It's like something out of a dream." The helicopter's roar intensified overhead, but the canyon's configuration seemed to confuse the sound, sending it bouncing in all directions. Jake watched through a gap in the rocks as the aircraft circled uncertainly before moving on toward the eastern ridges. "They're searching grid patterns," he observed. "Military precision. Pemberton's not taking any chances." Miguel explored the ruins while they waited, returning with items that made Jake's heart leap with hope. "Looks like this place was used by smugglers," he reported, holding up a cache of supplies wrapped in oiled canvas. Food, water purification tablets, and most importantly, he unwrapped the bundle to reveal 2 rifles and a box of ammunition that had somehow survived the desert's harsh conditions. The weapons were old but well-maintained, and Jake felt a surge of gratitude toward whatever desperate souls had hidden these supplies in this forgotten sanctuary. "Now we're talking," Carlos said, checking one of the rifle's actions with practiced hands. "Still not exactly even odds, but it's a start." The stallion had moved to the spring's edge, drinking deeply while keeping watch on the canyon entrance. In the dappled light filtering through the willows, his white coat seemed to glow with an inner radiance that defied rational explanation. Jake found himself wondering about the horse's origins, about the forces that had brought them together in this place of ancient power. As if sensing Jake's scrutiny, the stallion turned his great dark eyes toward him, and for a moment Jake felt a connection that transcended words or understanding. This was no ordinary animal. It was something more, something that belonged to the desert's deepest mysteries. The helicopter's sound had faded completely now, leaving only the whisper of wind through stone and the gentle murmur of flowing water. They had found temporary sanctuary, but Jake knew their pursuers would return with greater numbers and more sophisticated tracking equipment. When that happened, they would need to be ready. Time was running short, and the desert was about to become a battlefield where the stakes were nothing less than truth itself. The white stallion's hoofbeats echoed against the canyon walls as Jake pulled back on the makeshift reins, bringing the magnificent horse to a halt at the edge of a rocky outcropping. Below them stretched the valley where Blackwood's empire sprawled like a festering wound across the desert landscape. The main compound sat in the distance, its modern buildings and security towers a stark contrast to the rugged wilderness surrounding it. "There," Jake whispered, pointing toward a cluster of prefabricated structures near the eastern perimeter. "That's where they're keeping the evidence." Miguel squinted against the afternoon sun, his weathered face creased with concern. "Lot of guards down there, amigo. More than we counted on." Sarah shifted behind Jake, her arms wrapped around his waist as she studied the layout below. "The lab facility is separate from the main house. If we can create a distraction—" "No." Jake's voice was firm. "We're not splitting up again. We stick together, or we don't go at all." The stallion stamped impatiently beneath them, as if sensing the urgency of their mission. Over the past 3 days, the horse had led them through hidden trails and forgotten canyons, always staying one step ahead of Blackwood search parties. It was as if the animal understood their purpose, their desperate need to expose the truth about the toxic waste that had been poisoning the land and its people for years. Miguel dismounted and crept closer to the canyon's edge, studying the patrol patterns below. Guards change shift every 2 hours. Next rotation should be in 20 minutes. "What about the access road?" Sarah asked, sliding down from the stallion's back. "Single checkpoint," Jake observed. "But there's an old mining trail that runs along the western ridge. Looks like it connects to the service road behind the lab." The stallion nickered softly and nudged Jake's shoulder with its massive head. The horse's dark eyes seemed almost human in their intelligence, and Jake found himself wondering again about this mysterious creature that had appeared in their darkest hour. Where had it come from? Why had it chosen to help them? "We need those documents," Sarah said, breaking into his thoughts. "The shipping manifests, the disposal records, everything. Without them, Blackwood walks away clean." Miguel nodded grimly. "And more people die while he covers his tracks." Jake pulled out the worn map they'd taken from the security guard 3 days ago. Red X's marked the burial sites where barrels of toxic waste had been illegally dumped across hundreds of square miles. Some were dangerously close to underground water sources that supplied local communities. "He's been doing this for years," Jake muttered, "probably saving millions in proper disposal costs. While poisoning half the county," Sarah added bitterly. The stallion suddenly lifted its head, ears pricked forward. A moment later, they heard it too, the distant rumble of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. "They're expanding the search grid," Miguel said, shading his eyes as he scanned the horizon. Jake grabbed the stallion's mane and pulled himself onto its back. "We move now while they're focused on the air search." Sarah and Miguel quickly mounted behind him, and the stallion began picking its way down the treacherous canyon wall with sure-footed grace. The animal seemed to know exactly where to place each step, navigating loose rocks and narrow ledges that would have challenged an experienced mountain climber. As they descended, Jake's mind raced through their plan. Get into the lab facility, locate the records room, gather evidence, and get out before Blackwood's security forces could respond. Simple, in theory, but he knew the reality would be far more dangerous. The stallion reached level ground and immediately broke into a smooth gallop, following a dry creek bed that provided natural cover from aerial surveillance. Jake marveled at the horse's endurance and intelligence. Most animals would have been exhausted after 3 days of constant travel through the desert, but the stallion seemed only to grow stronger and more determined. "There!" Sarah called out, pointing ahead. The mining trail Miguel had spotted from above wound up the western slope, partially hidden by scrub brush and fallen rocks. The stallion veered toward it without hesitation, as if the horse had traveled this route many times before. As they climbed the narrow path, Jake caught glimpses of the lab facility through gaps in the vegetation. Security guards patrolled the perimeter with military precision, their weapons clearly visible. These weren't ordinary ranch hands, they were professional soldiers, and Jake realized that Blackwood's operation was even larger and more dangerous than they'd imagined. The stallion crested the ridge, and stopped beside a cluster of boulders that provided perfect cover. Below them, the lab facility's rear entrance was visible, along with the service road that connected to the main compound. A single guard stood watch near a loading dock where several trucks were parked. Jake checked his watch. 18 minutes until shift change. "This is it," he whispered. "Once we go down there, there's no turning back." The stallion snorted and pawed the ground, ready for action. The white stallion's hooves thundered against the hardpan as Jake gripped the makeshift reins, his body screaming with every jarring impact. Behind him, Maria pressed close, her arms wrapped around his waist while Carlos clung to her back. The horse moved with supernatural endurance, never slowing despite carrying 3 riders across the merciless terrain. "There!" Maria shouted over the wind, pointing toward a cluster of buildings shimmering in the distance. "San Refugio!" The small border town materialized from the heat haze like a mirage becoming real. Adobe structures lined a dusty main street, their terracotta walls baked golden by decades of desert sun. A few pickup trucks sat parked outside a cantina, and Jake could make out the faded sign of a telegraph office. As they approached the town's edge, the stallion began to slow, its breathing steady despite the impossible journey. Jake felt the animal's muscles ripple beneath him, still powerful but finally showing signs of the tremendous effort. They dismounted near a weathered water trough, and the horse immediately lowered its magnificent head to drink. "Incredible," Carlos whispered, running his hand along the stallion's neck. "No horse should be able to do what this one just did." Jake studied the animal as it drank. In the full light of day, the horse seemed even more otherworldly. Its coat pure white without a single marking, its eyes an unsettling pale blue that seemed almost human in their intelligence. When it raised its head from the trough, those eyes fixed on Jake with an intensity that made him shiver despite the heat. "We need to find the sheriff," Maria said, but Jake was already shaking his head. "No local law. Harrington owns half the politicians in 3 states. We need someone bigger." He gestured toward the telegraph office. "We send word to the state authorities, maybe even federal agents. That mass grave isn't just murder, it's crossing state lines, probably international borders too." They approached the telegraph office cautiously. The elderly operator looked up from his desk with curious eyes as the 3 sun-battered strangers entered. Jake pulled out the crumpled bills from his pocket, the last of his savings he'd grabbed before their ill-fated night shift. "Need to send urgent messages to Austin and El Paso," Jake said. "Police matter." The operator's demeanor shifted immediately. "What kind of police matter?" Maria stepped forward. "Mass murder. We have evidence of a burial site with dozens of victims." She described the location with precise detail, while Jake dictated messages to the Texas Rangers and FBI field office. As the telegraph keys clicked out their desperate appeals for help, Jake noticed movement outside the window. A black sedan was pulling into town, moving too fast for casual travel. His blood ran cold as he recognized the vehicle, one of Harrington's security team cars. "We need to go," he whispered urgently to the others. "Now." They slipped out the back door as the sedan stopped in front of the cantina. Jake could see 2 men in suits getting out, their movements precise and predatory. These weren't ranch hands or local muscle, they were professionals. The white stallion waited behind the building, as if it had known they would need a quick escape. Its pale eyes tracked the approaching danger with an awareness that defied explanation. As the 3 climbed onto its back once more, Jake heard voices from the front of the telegraph office, looking for 3 people. Ranch hands from the Double H, dangerous criminals. The operator's voice carried clearly in the desert air. "Haven't seen anyone like that, mister." Jake squeezed the stallion's sides gently, and the horse began moving away from town with deliberate quiet. They kept to the low ground, using dried creek beds and rocky outcroppings for cover. Behind them, San Refugio grew smaller until it was just another speck on the endless horizon. "Where now?" Carlos asked, his voice hoarse from thirst despite their brief respite. Jake considered their options. Harrington's men would be watching every town, every road, every place they might seek help. But their telegraph messages were already racing along the wires, carrying their story to people with real authority. They just had to stay alive long enough for help to arrive. "The old mining camp," Maria suggested. 20 miles north of the ranch. Been abandoned for years, but there's water and shelter." The stallion's ears pricked forward as if it understood, and it changed direction without any guidance from Jake. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, but the horse maintained its steady pace, navigating the treacherous terrain with uncanny skill. As they rode, Jake found himself studying the desert with new eyes. This wasn't just empty wasteland. It was a vast graveyard where Harrington had buried his crimes along with his victims. How many families had lost loved ones to that monster's greed? How many people had simply vanished into this burning emptiness? The white stallion carried them deeper into the wilderness, its pale form seeming to float across the shimmering landscape like a ghost seeking justice for the dead. The white stallion's hoofbeats thundered against the hard pan as Jake clung to its mane, his wounded shoulder screaming with each jarring stride. Behind them, dust clouds marked the pursuit of Morrison's men, their vehicles growing smaller but never disappearing entirely. The horse seemed to know exactly where it was heading, following invisible trails through the maze of arroyos and boulder fields. "Easy, boy," Jake whispered, feeling the animal's labored breathing beneath him. They'd been riding hard for over an hour, and even this magnificent creature had its limits. The stallion's coat was dark with sweat, foam flecking its neck where the makeshift rope halter rubbed. As they crested a low ridge, Jake spotted something that made his heart leap, a thin column of smoke rising in the distance. Not the black smoke of burning oil or machinery, but the grey-white wisp of a campfire. The stallion nickered softly, as if it too recognized the significance. They descended toward the source through a narrow canyon, the walls providing welcome shade and concealment. The smoke grew thicker, and Jake caught the scent of burning mesquite and something else. Coffee. His stomach clenched with hunger and hope. The canyon opened into a hidden box valley, green with unexpected vegetation fed by a natural spring. Near the water's edge sat a weathered prospector's camp, a patched canvas lean-to, a fire ring, and an old man bent over a coffee pot. He looked up as the white stallion emerged from the canyon mouth, his grizzled face showing no surprise, as if mysterious riders appeared in his hidden refuge every day. "Well, I'll be damned," the old man said, rising slowly. "Figured I might see you again, ghost." Jake slid down from the stallion's back, his legs nearly buckling. The horse moved immediately to the spring, lowering its head to drink deeply. "You know this horse?" Jake asked, swaying slightly. "Know him?" The prospector chuckled, a dry sound like wind through sage. "Hell, son, I raised him. Name's Ezra Holbrook, and you look like a man who's had himself a considerable day." Jake introduced himself while Ezra poured coffee into a tin cup. The hot liquid burned his throat, but it was the most beautiful pain he'd ever felt. Between sips he told his story, the bodies in the desert, Morrison's operation, the betrayal, and their desperate escape. Ezra listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of understanding. When Jake finished, the old man sat quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Been wondering when Morrison's chickens would come home to roost," Ezra finally said. "Been living out here for 15 years, watching that bastard's trucks roll through the desert at all hours. Knew it wasn't cattle they were moving. You know about the trafficking?" "Know about it, hell. I seen it. Watched them unload cargo that walked on 2 legs instead of 4. But what's one old prospector gonna do against a man with Morrison's reach?" Ezra spat into the fire, making it hiss. "Always figured someday someone would come along with the stones to do something about it." Jake felt a surge of hope. "Will you help us? We need to get this information to the authorities, but Morrison's got people everywhere. Local law, maybe even state level." "I know someone," Ezra said. "Federal marshal named Rebecca Santos. Straight as a surveyor's line and twice as tough. She's been sniffing around Morrison for months, but she needs evidence. How do we reach her?" Ezra pointed to an old radio setup, partially hidden under a tarp. Got me a ham radio. Can patch through to the federal building in Phoenix. But first, we better tend that shoulder of yours. You're bleeding through the shirt." As Ezra cleaned and bandaged Jake's wound with surprising gentleness, the white stallion wandered back from the spring. The horse nuzzled Jake's good shoulder, then moved to Ezra, who scratched behind its ears with obvious affection. "How did he find me out there?" Jake asked. "Ghost's got a way of showing up where he's needed most," Ezra replied. "Found him as a colt, half dead from thirst. Nursed him back, but he never took to being penned. Comes and goes as he pleases, but he's got a sense about people. Good people, anyway." The radio crackled to life as Ezra made contact with Phoenix. After several transfers and tense minutes of waiting, a crisp female voice came through the static. "This is Marshal Santos." Jake took the microphone, his heart pounding. "Marshal, my name is Jake Morrison, Jake Reeves. I have evidence of human trafficking operations in Pima County. The man responsible has been trying to kill me and my partners." A pause. "Then, can you get to the federal building?" "Negative. Too many people looking for us. But I can give you coordinates for mass grave sites and detailed information about the operation. Stand by." The radio went quiet except for static. Jake looked at Ezra, who nodded encouragingly. In the distance, Ghost lifted his head, ears pricked forward, as if sensing something on the wind that human ears couldn't detect. The white stallion's hoofbeats echoed through the canyon as Jake gripped the reins, his body still aching from their ordeal in the desert. Behind him, Carlos and Tommy rode double on the horse they'd managed to catch near the old mining camp, while ahead lay the lights of Esperanza, and what Jake hoped would be justice at last. "You sure Sheriff Hawkins ain't on Blackwood's payroll?" Carlos called out, his voice barely audible over the wind. Jake had wondered the same thing. In a town where Blackwood Industries owned half the businesses and employed a quarter of the population, trust was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Deputy Sarah Chen had been different. She'd grown up on a small ranch, lost it to foreclosure when the banks squeezed out the little guys. If anyone would listen, it might be her. The stallion seemed to sense their urgency, picking up pace as they approached the outskirts of town. Jake patted the horse's neck, marveling again at how this magnificent creature had appeared just when they needed it most. There was something almost supernatural about the timing, as if the desert itself had sent them a guardian. They rode straight to the sheriff's office, a squat adobe building that looked more like a fortress than a place of law. Light spilled from the windows. Someone was working late. Jake dismounted and helped Tommy down, noticing how the youngest of their group still favored his injured ankle. "Remember," Jake said quietly, "we stick to the facts. What we saw, what we heard, what we can prove." The bell above the door chimed as they entered. Deputy Chen looked up from a stack of paperwork, her dark eyes widening as she took in their appearance. Clothes torn and sun-bleached, faces burned and stubbled, eyes hollow from days of survival. "Jesus, what happened to you three?" She was on her feet immediately, reaching for the first aid kit. "We need to talk to you about Marcus Blackwood," Jake said without preamble, "about what's really happening out at his operation." Chen's expression grew cautious. "You boys been drinking? You look like you've been through hell." "We have," Tommy spoke up, his voice stronger than Jake expected. "Because Blackwood left us to die in the Saguaro Flats." For the next hour, they laid out everything. The strange shipments they'd witnessed, the unmarked trucks, the men who didn't look like any ranch hands they'd ever seen. Chen listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes, her expression growing more troubled with each detail. "The thing is," Jake concluded, "we can't prove most of it. But there's something big going down, something worth killing to keep secret." Chen leaned back in her chair, drumming her fingers on the desk. "Marcus Blackwood's got friends in high places. You're talking about a man who donates to the sheriff's RE2 election campaign, sponsors the annual rodeo, built the new wing on the hospital." "We know how it sounds," Carlos said, "but people are dead, Sarah, and we almost joined them." She studied their faces for a long moment. "Let's say I believe you, and I'm not saying I don't, but what you're describing, Human trafficking may be worse. That's federal jurisdiction. FBI, DEA, maybe both. Jake felt his heart sink. Federal agents would take weeks to mobilize, if they even believed the story. By then, Blackwood could move his operation, destroy evidence, maybe eliminate more witnesses. There might be another way, Chen said slowly. My cousin works for the Border Patrol. Good man, not interested in politics or payoffs. If I called him tonight, explained the situation. How long? Jake asked. He could have a team here by morning. Unofficial reconnaissance at first, but if they find what you say is there. A sound outside made them all freeze, vehicles pulling up, doors slamming. Chen's hand moved instinctively to a service weapon as shadows passed by the windows. You expecting company? Jake whispered. Before she could answer, the front door burst open. Sheriff Hawkins strode in, flanked by two men Jake didn't recognize, hard-faced types in expensive suits that looked out of place in Esperanza. Well, well, Hawkins drawled, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. Heard we had some guests causing trouble, boys who don't know when to mind their own business. Chen stepped forward. Sheriff, these men came in to report. I know what they came to report, Hawkins cut her off. And I know it's nothing but lies and speculation. Isn't that right, boys? The two men in suits moved to flank the door, cutting off any escape route. Jake's mind raced, calculating odds and distances. The white stallion waited outside, but it might as well have been 100 miles away. Now, Hawkins continued, his voice taking on a dangerous edge, seems to me these fellas have been through quite an ordeal. Dehydrated, probably hallucinating. Might need some medical attention at a private facility where they can recover. Jake met Chen's eyes, seeing his own realization reflected there. They'd walked into a trap, and this time there would be no miraculous rescue. The net was closing, and Blackwood's reach was longer than any of them had imagined. The white stallion's hooves thundered against the hardpan as Jake leaned low over its neck, the wind whipping tears from his eyes. Behind them, the dust cloud of Cromwell's men grew larger, their engines roaring like mechanical beasts hungry for blood. The horse's breathing came in powerful rhythmic bursts, but Jake could feel the animal's exhaustion in the slight tremor of its muscles. Come on, boy, Jake whispered, his voice barely audible over the rushing wind. Just a little further. The radio in his saddlebags crackled with Sheriff Martinez's voice, but the static made her words impossible to understand. Jake knew she was out there somewhere, racing toward them with backup, but would she arrive in time? The coordinates he'd managed to transmit before the chase began were their only lifeline now. A rifle crack split the air, and dirt exploded near the stallion's front hooves. The horse didn't flinch, didn't break stride, as if it understood that stopping meant death for both of them. Jake pressed himself flatter against the animal's neck, feeling the coarse mane against his cheek as another shot rang out. The landscape blurred past them in shades of brown and gold, broken only by the occasional Joshua tree or boulder formation. Jake's mind raced as fast as the horse's hooves. Even if they reached help, would anyone believe his story? Cromwell's influence stretched far beyond his ranch, into courthouses and police departments across 3 counties. The billionaire had built an empire on secrets and blood money, and Jake was just a drifter with a wild tale about human trafficking and desert graves. But he had the photos now. The evidence stored on the camera card in his pocket felt heavier than lead, each image a testament to the horrors he'd witnessed. Miguel's face flashed in his memory, followed by Carlos and the dozens of other victims whose bones littered Cromwell's killing ground. They deserved justice, even if it cost Jake his life. The stallion suddenly veered left, heading toward a narrow canyon that cut between 2 mesa formations. Jake had never seen this passage before, but he trusted the horse's instincts completely. The animal had appeared from nowhere when they needed it most, almost as if it were some desert spirit sent to guide them home. As they entered the canyon, the sound of their pursuers' engines echoed off the rock walls, amplified into a deafening roar. Jake risked a glance backward and saw the first ATV round the bend, its rider raising a rifle. The passage was too narrow for the vehicles to spread out, which bought them precious seconds, but it also meant there was nowhere to hide. The canyon floor rose steadily, winding between walls of red sandstone that reached toward the cloudless sky. Jake's chest burned as he struggled to breathe the thin air, but the stallion showed no signs of slowing. If anything, the horse seemed to gain strength as they climbed higher, as if this desolate country were its true home. Another rifle shot boomed behind them, followed by the sharp ping of a ricochet. Jake felt something tug at his sleeve and realized how close that bullet had come. Cromwell's men were gaining ground, their machines better suited for sustained pursuit than even the legendary endurance of a desert Mustang. Then Jake saw it, a break in the canyon wall ahead, partially hidden by a fall of loose rock. The stallion aimed directly for the gap, and Jake suddenly understood. This wasn't just a random escape route. It was a carefully chosen path that only someone who knew this country intimately would recognize. They squeezed through the opening just as the canyon filled with the roar of engines behind them. Jake heard shouting, then the squeal of brakes as the ATV riders realized their quarry had vanished. On the other side of the gap, they emerged onto a broad plateau dotted with sagebrush and carved by arroyos. In the distance, Jake could see a thin line of dust approaching from the east, vehicles moving fast across the desert floor. His heart hammered against his ribs as he tried to determine if they were friend or foe. Then sunlight glinted off something metallic, and he caught sight of the distinctive shape of patrol cars. The stallion had brought him home. Sheriff Martinez's voice crackled through the radio with sudden clarity. "Jake, if you can hear this, we've got you on visual. There's a helicopter inbound with federal agents. Hold your position." Jake pulled gently on the stallion's mane, and the great horse slowed to a canter, then a walk. Steam rose from its sweat-darkened coat as they waited on the plateau, watching the line of law enforcement vehicles draw closer. Behind them, the narrow gap remained silent. Cromwell's men had lost the trail. For the first time in days, Jake allowed himself to believe they might actually survive this. The white stallion had carried him through hell and delivered him to salvation, just as it had appeared from nowhere to save his life in the desert. Whatever happened next, Miguel and Carlos would finally have their justice. The white stallion's hooves thundered against the hardpan as Jake urged him toward the distant lights of Millbrook. Behind them, the desert stretched like a black ocean, swallowing the chaos they'd left at Morrison's compound. The wind whipped through Jake's hair, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and the weight of everything that had transpired. Beside him, Maria rode low on her borrowed horse, clutching the saddlebags containing the evidence that would bring Morrison down. Tommy flanked their other side, his face grim but determined. They'd made it out alive, but Jake knew their fight was far from over. Morrison still had resources, still had men who'd kill to protect his empire of blood and bones. As they crested a small rise, the town of Millbrook spread before them like a constellation fallen to earth. Street lamps cast amber pools along Main Street, and Jake could make out the sheriff's office, its windows glowing with warm light. But something felt wrong. Too many vehicles lined the street for this time of night, and shadows moved with purpose between the buildings. "Hup," Jake whispered, pulling back on the stallion's reins. The magnificent horse responded instantly, coming to a halt that barely disturbed the dust beneath his hooves. Maria's eyes scanned the town below. "Morrison's men? Has to be," Tommy muttered. "Bastard probably called ahead, got half the county looking for us." Jake studied the layout, his mind racing. The sheriff's office sat in the center of town, surrounded by open street on all sides. Getting there would mean crossing a killing field if Morrison's people were waiting. But they needed to get those files to someone with authority, someone who could act on what they'd found. The white stallion shifted beneath him, and Jake felt the animal's tension. The horse sensed danger too, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. For a moment, Jake wondered at the bond that had formed between them, this partnership forged in desperation and tempered by survival. There, Maria pointed to a small building at the edge of town. "Doc Patterson's clinic. He's good people, been treating folks in these parts for 30 years. If anyone will help us, it's him." Jake nodded. The clinic sat away from the main thoroughfare, accessible through a network of back alleys and side streets. It wasn't perfect, but it was their best shot at getting help without walking into a trap. They picked their way down the slope, keeping to the shadows cast by scrub brush and rocky outcroppings. The horses moved quietly, their riders alert for any sign of movement ahead. As they reached the outskirts of town, Jake could hear voices carrying on the night air, men coordinating searching. The back alley behind the clinic was narrow and dark, lined with garbage cans and forgotten equipment. Jake dismounted first, his boots hitting the ground silently. The white stallion nuzzled his shoulder, and Jake found himself stroking the animal's neck, drawing comfort from the contact. "I'll go first," Maria whispered, sliding down from her horse. "Doc Patterson knows me, won't be spooked if I show up at his back door." Before Jake could protest, he was moving toward the clinic's rear entrance, the saddlebags clutched against her chest. She knocked softly, a pattern that suggested familiarity. After what seemed like an eternity, the door opened, spilling yellow light into the alley. Jake couldn't make out the words, but he heard Maria's urgent whispers and an older man's surprised responses. Then she was gesturing for them to come forward, and Jake led the white stallion toward the light. Doc Patterson was a thin man with silver hair and keen eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. He looked them over quickly, taking in their battered condition and the magnificent horse that stood calmly beside Jake. "Inside, all of you," the doctor said quietly. "I've got a storage room in back where you can clean up and figure out your next move." As they filed into the clinic, Jake caught sight of the main street through a front window. Pickup trucks and SUVs were parked at intervals, and men with rifles stood in doorways, their attention focused outward, watching for any sign of their quarry. "Morrison's got the whole town locked down," Doc Patterson observed, following Jake's gaze. "Been spreading word that you three are dangerous fugitives, armed and unstable. Got folks scared enough to stay indoors while his boys do their hunting." "We've got evidence," Maria said, hefting the saddlebags. "Proof of what he's been doing out there in the desert. Financial records, shipping manifests, communications with his buyers. It's all here." The doctor's expression hardened. "I've suspected something for years. Too many people going missing, too many questions without answers. But Morrison's got half the county government in his pocket, and the other half too scared to move against him." Jake felt a familiar weight settle on his shoulders, the knowledge that their fight was bigger than just survival now. They'd uncovered something that reached deep into the community, corruption that would take more than evidence to root out. The white stallion stamped softly outside the window, and Jake knew their next move would determine everything. The desert dawn cast long shadows across the rocky outcropping where Jake, Maria, and Sam had spent the night. The white stallion stood sentinel nearby, its coat gleaming like polished marble in the early light. Below them, Thornfield's compound sprawled like a fortress of glass and steel, an alien intrusion in the ancient landscape. Jake studied the complex through his father's old binoculars, counting guards and noting their patrol patterns. 6 men visible, probably more inside. They've got the main house, that laboratory building, and what looks like holding pens on the east side. "The children could be anywhere," Maria whispered, her voice tight with urgency. "We saw at least a dozen kids in those photos." Sam checked his revolver, the weight familiar and reassuring in his weathered hands. 3 against 6 ain't terrible odds, but we need to be smart about this. That man's got resources we can't imagine." The stallion nickered softly and stepped closer to Jake, pressing its massive head against his shoulder. In that moment of contact, images flashed through Jake's mind, clearer now than ever before. He saw ventilation shafts, emergency exits, and most importantly, a basement level where frightened children huddled together in sterile rooms. "Underground," Jake said suddenly. "There's a whole level beneath the main building. That's where he's keeping them." Maria stared at him. "How could you possibly know that?" Jake glanced at the stallion, uncertain how to explain the connection he felt. I know." They spent the next hour planning their approach, using the horse's apparent knowledge of the terrain to identify blind spots in the compound's security. The stallion seemed to understand their mission, pawing at specific locations on their crude map drawn in the dirt. As the sun climbed higher, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold, they began their descent. The stallion led them through a maze of arroyos and boulder fields, moving with supernatural grace and silence. When they reached the perimeter fence, the horse positioned itself between them and the nearest guard tower, its white coat somehow blending with the play of light and shadow. Jake cut through the chain link with wire cutters while Maria and Sam kept watch. The compound's proximity sensors had been mysteriously disabled, another inexplicable stroke of fortune that Jake was beginning to attribute to their four-legged guardian. They moved like ghosts across the manicured grounds, slipping between buildings under the stallion's guidance. The horse seemed to know exactly when guards would round corners or when surveillance cameras would sweep their direction. At the main building's service entrance, Jake found the door unlocked, another impossibility that he chose not to question. They descended into the basement level, following sterile corridors lit by harsh fluorescent bulbs. The antiseptic smell made Maria's stomach turn as memories of her own childhood surfaced. Behind the third door they tried, they found them. 12 children, ages ranging from perhaps 8 to 16, all bearing the hollow-eyed look of trauma. They wore matching grey uniforms and seemed terrified when the door opened. "It's okay," Maria whispered in Spanish, then English. "We're here to help. We're getting you out." A girl who couldn't have been older than 10 stepped forward, her chin raised defiantly despite her obvious fear. "Are you with him? With the man who brings the needles?" "No," Jake said firmly. "We're here to stop him." The children's faces transformed as hope replaced despair. They moved quickly and quietly, following Maria's gentle instructions as Jake and Sam checked the corridor. The stallion appeared at the emergency exit as if materializing from thin air, its presence somehow having unlocked the alarmed door. Getting 12 children across the compound should have been impossible, but the stallion seemed to weave protection around them. Guards looked the other way at crucial moments, radio communications mysteriously failed, and security cameras malfunctioned with perfect timing. They were almost to the fence when Thornfield's voice boomed across the compound through hidden speakers. "Mr. Morrison, I know you're here. You've caused me considerable inconvenience, but I'm willing to make a deal. The children for your silence. Walk away now, and we can both continue our lives." Jake felt rage burn in his chest, but the stallion's gentle nudge reminded him of what mattered most. The children came first. Justice could wait. They reached the fence as pursuit began in earnest. Guards poured from the buildings, their shouts echoing off the canyon walls. Jake pushed the children through the gap he'd cut, counting desperately as bullets began to whisper overhead. The stallion reared up between them and their pursuers, its hooves striking sparks from the rocky ground. In that moment, it seemed less like a horse and more like an avenging angel, magnificent and terrible in its protective fury. "Go!" Sam shouted, firing covering shots as the last child squeezed through the fence. "Get them to safety!" The white stallion led them into the maze of canyons beyond, its knowledge of hidden trails and secret passages proving invaluable once again. Behind them, Thornfield's compound erupted in chaos as their carefully orchestrated rescue dissolved into confusion and pursuit. The white stallion's hooves thundered against the desert floor as Jake urged him forward, the wind whipping through his hair like a promise of redemption. Behind them, the compound grew smaller, but the weight of what they'd discovered pressed heavy on his shoulders. Marcus Kane's empire wasn't built on oil and real estate, it was built on blood, human trafficking, and the kind of suffering that made Jake's stomach turn. The satellite phone in his saddlebag felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. One call to the FBI, and Kane's world would come crashing down. But Jake knew the billionaire wouldn't go quietly into the night. Men like Kane had too much to lose, and too many resources to simply surrender. As the stallion crested a rocky ridge, Jake spotted movement in the distance. Dust clouds rising like smoke signals against the azure sky. Kane's men, no doubt, spreading out in search patterns across the desert. The rancher had probably called in every favor, hired every gun for hire he could find. The net was tightening. Jake guided the stallion down into a narrow arroyo, the ancient waterway carved deep into the earth by flash floods long past. The walls rose 20 feet on either side, providing cover from prying eyes. Here, among the shadows and silence, he finally allowed himself to stop and think. The stallion's flanks heaved with exertion, but his dark eyes remained alert, ears swiveling at every sound. This magnificent creature had saved Jake's life more times than he could count, appearing when hope seemed lost, carrying him through impossible odds. Now, as Jake's fingers found the phone, he wondered if their luck had finally run out. The first number he dialed went straight to voicemail. FBI field office closed for the weekend. The second rang endlessly before cutting off. Frustration clawed at Jake's chest as he realized that salvation might be just as elusive as the justice they sought. Then he remembered Deputy Sarah Chen. She'd been asking questions about Kane for months, following paper trails that led nowhere, investigating complaints that mysteriously disappeared. If anyone would believe what Jake had seen, it would be her. Her phone rang twice before her familiar voice crackled through the static. "Chen here. Sarah, it's Jake Morrison. I need your help." A pause. "Jake, where the hell are you? There's an APB out on you and your friends. Kane's saying you kidnapped him, stole his helicopter." "Sarah, listen to me." Jake's voice cut through her words like a blade. "Kane's compound isn't what it seems. There are people being held there against their will. Women, children. I saw them with my own eyes." "That's a serious accusation, Jake. You're going to need proof." "I have proof." Jake's hand moved to the camera in his other pocket, the memory card containing images that would destroy Kane's carefully constructed facade. Photos, documentation. "But Kane's got men hunting me down. I need protection, and those people need help." The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the desert wind whistling through the arroyo walls. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more focused. "Where are you now?" Jake looked around, trying to orient himself in the maze of canyon walls. "About 15 miles northeast of Kane's Spread. In the old river channels. I know the area. There's an abandoned mining station about 5 miles due east of your position. Can you make it there?" "I think so." "Good. I'll meet you there with backup." "And Jake?" Her voice softened slightly. "Whatever you've stumbled into, we're going to see it through. Those people deserve justice." The phone went dead, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the steady breathing of the white stallion. Justice. The word had taken on new meaning over the past few days. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, or even getting revenge on Kane for leaving him and his friends to die. It was about the faces he'd seen behind those compound walls. The fear, the desperation, the hope that someone, somewhere, might care enough to help. Jake swung back into the saddle, feeling the familiar strength of the stallion beneath him. The horse seemed to sense their destination without guidance, picking his way carefully through the rocky terrain toward the east. Behind them, the dust clouds were getting closer, but Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in days: hope. The mining station materialized out of the heat shimmer like a mirage made real. Rusted equipment and abandoned buildings scattered across a small plateau, but Jake could see fresh tire tracks in the sand. Sarah was already there, waiting. As they approached, Jake caught sight of her patrol car tucked behind a collapsed water tower. 2 other vehicles sat nearby, federal plates glinting in the afternoon sun. His heart hammered against his ribs as he realized the magnitude of what was about to unfold. The white stallion slowed to a walk, then stopped completely. Jake dismounted, his legs unsteady after hours in the saddle, and placed his hand on the horse's neck in gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to the magnificent creature, "for everything." The white stallion's hooves thundered against the hardpan as Jake, Maria, and Ben rode toward the lights of Copper Ridge. The town sprawled before them like scattered diamonds against black velvet, unaware that their world was about to change forever. Jake clutched the evidence folder tighter against his chest, feeling the weight of dozens of photographs and documents that would bring down Marcus Blackwood's empire. There, Maria pointed toward the sheriff's office, its windows glowing amber in the pre-dawn darkness. Sheriff Martinez should be starting his early shift soon. The stallion seemed to understand their urgency, his powerful stride eating up the distance between them and justice. As they approached the outskirts of town, Jake spotted movement near the old grain elevator, black SUVs positioned like predators waiting to strike. "Company," Ben muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle they'd salvaged from Blackwood's compound. Jake counted at least 6 vehicles, their occupants no doubt armed and desperate. Blackwood's men had anticipated their route, probably the only logical path from the desert back to civilization. The billionaire wasn't going down without a fight. "We need another way in," Jake said, guiding the stallion toward the creek bed that wound around the town's eastern edge. The horse responded instantly, his white coat ghostly in the starlight as they descended into the natural trench carved by decades of flash floods. The creek bed provided cover, but it also slowed their progress. Jake could hear engines rumbling above them, searching. Blackwood's men were systematic, professional, the kind of security money could buy when your entire empire was built on blood and lies. "The back of the sheriff's office connects to Miller's hardware store," Maria whispered. "If we can reach the alley behind Main Street." A spotlight suddenly blazed down into the creek bed, catching them in its merciless glare. Shouts erupted from above as armed figures rappelled down the steep banks. The stallion reared, his powerful legs striking out at the first man to reach the bottom. "Go!" Ben shouted, providing covering fire as Jake and Maria urged the horse forward. The creek bed echoed with gunshots and the stallion's defiant neighing. They burst from the creek bed onto Main Street like something out of legend, 3 desperate riders on a white horse, carrying evidence that would topple a king. The sheriff's office was 50 yards away, its porch light a beacon of hope in the chaos. Behind them, Blackwood's men emerged from the creek bed, their vehicles converging on Main Street with military precision. The trap was closing, but they were so close now that Jake could see Sheriff Martinez's silhouette in the office window. The stallion's muscles bunched as a black SUV roared around the corner, trying to cut them off. With supernatural grace, the horse leaped over the vehicle's hood, his hooves clattering against metal before touching down on the other side. Jake heard the driver curse in amazement. 20 yards, 10. A rifle shot cracked through the air, and Jake felt the bullet whistle past his ear. The stallion stumbled but kept running, his determination matching their own. Blood trickled from a graze along his shoulder, but the magnificent animal refused to stop. Sheriff Martinez burst through his office door, service weapon drawn, just as they reached the porch. His weathered face registered shock at the sight of 3 riders appearing out of the night like avenging angels. "Sheriff!" Jake shouted, sliding down from the stallion's back and thrusting the evidence folder toward the lawman. "Marcus Blackwood. Human trafficking, murder, everything's in there." Martinez grabbed the folder, his eyes widening as he glimpsed the photographs inside. Behind them, Blackwood's vehicles screeched to a halt, but their occupants remained inside, unwilling to openly assault a sheriff's office. "Jesus Christ," Martinez breathed, flipping through pages of damning evidence. Where did this come from?" "His private compound in Devil's Canyon," Maria said, dismounting carefully. "We barely made it out alive." Ben kept watch on the SUVs, their engines still running, occupants undoubtedly radioing for instructions. Without the element of surprise, even Blackwood's mercenaries couldn't simply gun down witnesses in front of the sheriff's office. The stallion stood beside them, sides heaving from the desperate ride, but his dark eyes alert and proud. Jake placed a gentle hand on the horse's neck, feeling the steady pulse of life beneath the white coat. "You did it, boy," he whispered. "We all did it." Sheriff Martinez was already on his radio, calling for backup and state investigators. The evidence folder contained enough material to launch a dozen federal investigations. Blackwood's empire, built on the suffering of countless victims, would crumble under the weight of truth. As sirens began to wail in the distance, the black SUVs reluctantly pulled away, their occupants disappearing into the night like shadows. The battle was won, but Jake knew the war was just beginning. The white stallion's hoofbeats thundered across the desert floor as Jake pressed the horse harder than he ever had before. Behind him, the orange glow of flames painted the horizon, where Blackstone's compound burned, but ahead lay only darkness and the faint lights of Copper Ridge in the distance. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying with it the acrid smell of smoke and the weight of everything that had transpired. Marcus and Elena rode flanked by Sheriff Davidson's deputies, their horses struggling to match the stallion's relentless pace. The evidence, documents, hard drives, and witness testimonies was secured in saddlebags that bounced rhythmically with each gallop. Every stride brought them closer to justice, but Jake couldn't shake the feeling that Blackstone wouldn't go down without one final desperate gambit. As they crested a rocky outcrop, the lights of town spread before them like scattered diamonds. The courthouse sat at the center, its windows glowing warmly in the pre-dawn darkness. Federal agents were already waiting, having been contacted by Davidson hours earlier. The conspiracy that had claimed so many lives, that had turned the desert into a graveyard of secrets, was finally about to see the light. Jake slowed the stallion as they approached the courthouse steps. The magnificent horse's flanks heaved with exertion, steam rising from his white coat in the cool morning air. The animal had carried them through hell itself, never faltering, never giving up. As Jake dismounted, he pressed his palm against the stallion's neck, feeling the powerful heartbeat beneath. "Thank you," he whispered, and the horse turned those intelligent dark eyes toward him with what seemed like understanding. Sheriff Davidson was waiting at the courthouse entrance, his weathered face grim but determined. "The feds are here," he said simply. "They're ready for everything you've got." Inside, the next several hours passed in a blur of statements, evidence cataloging, and debriefings. Marcus recounted the human trafficking operation with clinical precision, his engineer's mind organizing the horror into digestible facts. Elena provided details about the victims, the cover-ups, the money trails that led back to Blackstone's empire. Jake told them about the desert, about Sarah, about watching friends die, while powerful men played God with human lives. By noon, federal agents were already moving on Blackstone's other properties. The billionaire himself had vanished in the chaos of the compound's destruction, but his financial empire was crumbling as accounts were frozen and warrants were issued. The story broke on national news within hours, a sprawling tale of corruption that reached from desert ranches to corporate boardrooms. As the sun reached its peak, Jake found himself standing alone on the courthouse steps. The stallion waited patiently at the hitching post, somehow managing to look regal despite the dust and sweat of their desperate ride. People had gathered in the street, drawn by the commotion and the growing media presence. But Jake's attention was fixed on the horizon, where heat waves shimmered above the desert that had nearly claimed his life. Marcus and Elena emerged from the courthouse, their faces bearing the exhaustion of people who had carried an impossible burden for too long. Elena's eyes were red-rimmed but clear, the weight of secrets finally lifted from her shoulders. Marcus moved with the careful precision of someone whose broken ribs were still healing, but his engineer's mind was already turning toward the future. "What happens now?" Elena asked, shading her eyes against the harsh midday sun. Jake considered the question. The ranch where they'd worked was gone, consumed by Blackstone's web of lies. Their old lives had ended in that desert, burned away like everything else that had been corrupted by proximity to such evil. But somehow, standing here in the honest sunlight with the truth finally spoken, the future seemed full of possibility rather than dread. "We rebuild," Jake said finally, "somewhere clean." The stallion nickered softly, tossing his magnificent head. Jake approached the horse slowly, running his hands along the powerful neck. Throughout their ordeal, the animal had been their guardian, their salvation, their connection to something pure in a world gone mad with greed. But now, with civilization restored and justice taking its course, Jake wondered if the stallion's work was done. As if reading his thoughts, the horse stepped back, moving away from the hitching post with fluid grace. The stallion looked at each of them in turn, Jake, Marcus, Elena, with those dark, knowing eyes. Then, without warning, the magnificent creature reared up on his hind legs, forelegs pawing the air in a gesture that seemed part farewell, part benediction. The stallion landed softly, turned toward the open desert, and began to trot away. His white coat gleamed like polished marble in the sunlight, and with each stride he seemed to become more ethereal, more legend than flesh. By the time he reached the edge of town, he was galloping again, free and wild as the wind itself. Jake watched until the stallion disappeared into the heat shimmer, becoming one with the endless horizon. Somewhere out there, the desert waited, vast, unforgiving but clean. And somewhere in that vastness, a white stallion ran free, carrying with him the gratitude of 3 souls he had saved and the promise that some things in this world remained untouchable by human corruption. The truth had set them all free.